Sandra Bullock stepped onto the red carpet of the Parisian fashion show, her beige dress standing in stark contrast to the sea of shimmering sequins and bold couture around her. The event was extravagant, flashy, loud, demanding attention. But Sandra had never needed to demand anything. Her elegance was effortless, the kind that didn't scream for validation but carried an unspoken power. Photographers called her name, cameras flashed, but among the murmurs of admiration, another kind of whisper lingered in the air. Just a few seats away, two social media influencers exchanged amused glances, their manicured hands covering soft giggles. "That's Sandra Bullock, right?" One of them scoffed, her voice dripping with condescension. "Yeah, but beige, at a show like this?" The other stifled a laugh. She was a star years ago, but now, trying to stay relevant. Sandra heard them. She always did. Years in Hollywood had trained her to filter out the noise, to pretend indifference. But there was something about their words tonight, something venomous, something sharper than the usual whispers. What they didn't know was that someone else had heard them too. Someone sitting just behind them, someone whose presence alone could silence an entire room. And in just a few moments, Keanu Reeves would change everything. The night was electric, the air thick with the scent of fresh flowers arranged at the entrance of the grand venue. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with energy, the kind that only the most elite fashion events could create. The runway gleamed under bright overhead lights, the stage set for a spectacle of luxury and power. Sandra sat in the front row, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. The whispers behind her hadn't gone unnoticed, but she refused to acknowledge them. She had faced worse, endured harsher criticism, and yet something about their tone dug deeper. Not because it was new, but because it was predictable. The same old story: age, relevance, fading stardom. The influencers, oblivious to anything beyond their own bubble, continued. "She could have at least tried," one murmured, eyes flickering over Sandra's dress. "Like, who even wears that to an event like this?" "She's holding on to the past," the other smirked. "It's kind of sad, don't you think?" Sandra's fingers curled slightly around the fabric of her dress. She didn't react, but she felt it. The sting, the weight of being reduced to a whisper, a joke. And then something changed. A subtle shift in the air, a sound, soft, deliberate, a throat clearing behind them. The influencers stiffened. It was nothing, wasn't it? Just some other guest overhearing their casual gossip. But then the silence stretched a second too long, heavy, intentional. Sandra felt it first. That presence. Slowly she turned her head. And there he was, Keanu Reeves. Seated directly behind them, dressed in a sharp black suit, his expression calm, unreadable. He wasn't someone who sought attention, but his presence commanded it. His posture was relaxed, but there was something in his eyes, an awareness, a quiet calculation. He had heard every word. The influencers hadn't turned around yet, still assuming they were untouchable, but that was about to change. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his voice smooth, casual. "Funny," he said. Just one word, but the weight of it was enough to shift the entire night. The influencers froze. The casual smirks on their faces wavered, their bodies tensing as if a chill had crept into the air. Slowly, almost reluctantly, they turned around. Their eyes widened the moment they saw him. Keanu Reeves. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. He was simply watching them with a kind of stillness that was far more unsettling than anger. His gaze was steady, unreadable, yet there was something in it that made their confidence crack like fragile glass. One of them forced a nervous laugh, a poor attempt to brush off the moment. "Oh, hi," she said, flipping her hair, her voice suddenly too bright. "We were just talking about fashion, you know? These events always bring out a lot of opinions." Keanu's lips barely moved, but there was the faintest tilt of his head, an unspoken challenge. "I see," he said, voice calm. "But I don't think you were talking about fashion." The influencer's smile faltered. "Oh well, we didn't mean anything bad by it." Keanu leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "Didn't you?" His voice was quiet, but it carried an unmistakable weight. The kind that didn't need to be raised to be heard. The other influencer, desperate to regain control, let out a breathy laugh. "Come on, it was just a joke," she said. "No need for this whole vibe." Sandra remained silent, watching the entire scene unfold. She had spent years brushing off comments like these, training herself to let them roll off her back. But watching Keanu, watching him step in without hesitation, without needing to raise his voice, something inside her shifted. Keanu glanced at Sandra then, just for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement. He wasn't doing this for attention. He wasn't doing this for drama. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. And the influencers, they knew it too. Because now, for the first time tonight, they were the ones being watched. The tension in the air had changed. It was no longer just an awkward moment. It was something heavier, something irreversible. Around them, guests had noticed the shift. Subtle glances, quick whispers. The models on the runway kept walking, the music played on, but in the front row, the real spectacle was unfolding. One of the influencers, desperate to regain some sense of control, tried to laugh. "Seriously, it wasn't that deep," she said, her voice strained. "We were just making small talk." Keanu's expression didn't change. He let the silence stretch just a second too long before speaking. "Small talk," he repeated, as if weighing the words. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he asked, "Tell me, what part was funny?" The other influencer fidgeted, suddenly very aware of how many eyes were now on them. "I mean, we were just commenting on the dress," she stammered. Keanu exhaled quietly, shaking his head just slightly as if disappointed. "No," he said simply. "You weren't." The influencers' faces burned. They were scrambling, their once effortless arrogance now slipping through their fingers. They had spent so much time tearing others down, so sure that no one would challenge them. But now, they weren't the ones in control. Sandra sat still, watching it all unfold. For years, she had trained herself to ignore these moments, to swallow the sting, to act as if it didn't matter. But something about tonight felt different. Because tonight, she wasn't alone. Keanu wasn't just calling them out, he was making them feel the weight of their own words. And for the first time in a long time, Sandra didn't feel invisible. The influencers opened their mouths to say something, to defend themselves, to shift the blame, to rewrite the moment. But before they could, a quiet voice interrupted. Sandra's. She turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto theirs. And then, with the same calm, steady tone Keanu had used, she said, "Funny," because it didn't sound like a joke. The impact was immediate. The influencers sat frozen, their confidence shattered. Because now, the words they had thrown so carelessly had turned against them, and there was nothing they could do to take them back. A heavy silence settled over the front row, stretching between the influencers and the rest of the audience like an invisible barrier. The music swelled as models continued down the runway, but no one was paying attention to the fashion show anymore. All eyes were on them. The influencers squirmed under the weight of the moment. A forced smile flickered across one of their faces, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Come on, Sandra," she said, voice tight. "You know how these things are. People talk. It's nothing personal." Sandra didn't blink. "Nothing personal," she repeated, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. "That's an interesting way to describe mocking someone you don't even know." Keanu remained silent, his gaze locked onto them, waiting, letting them sink in their own discomfort. He didn't need to add anything. Sandra had taken the lead now. One of the influencers let out a nervous laugh, shifting in her seat. "We were just joking around," she muttered. "It wasn't meant to be serious." Sandra leaned back slightly, her expression calm. "And yet here we are," she said simply. The influencer swallowed hard, realizing too late that they had lost. From a few seats down, a well-known magazine editor let out a quiet of disapproval. Another guest adjusted their seat, casting the influencers a long, unimpressed glance. The energy in the room had turned against them, and they knew it. The younger of the two reached for her phone, quickly opening Instagram, pretending to be busy. But it was useless. The damage had been done. Then, from the other side of the runway, something unexpected happened. A distinguished woman, elegant, refined, stood up from her seat. She was a veteran in the fashion industry, someone whose opinion held weight. Slowly, deliberately, she clapped. Once, twice. Then someone else joined in. And another. The applause was quiet at first, restrained, but it spread like wildfire, rippling through the front row. It wasn't just for Sandra, it was for something bigger, a moment of silent rebellion against the cruelty that had been normalized for far too long. Sandra felt a warmth rise in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. She glanced at Keanu. He was already looking at her, and this time, he did smile. Not for the influencers, not for the spectacle, but for her. And just like that, Sandra Bullock was no longer the woman they whispered about. She was the one they watched. The applause faded, but the shift in the room was permanent. The influencers sat stiffly, trapped in the weight of their own words, knowing there was no graceful way out. The power had left their hands and they could feel it slipping further with every passing second. Sandra, however, sat with a quiet confidence she hadn't felt in a long time. Not because she had won, but because for the first time in years she hadn't let them win. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his job done. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. Sometimes the most powerful statements weren't made through anger, but through quiet, unwavering truth. One of the influencers, desperate to salvage her pride, let out a forced laugh. "Wow, people are really taking things too seriously," she said, tossing her hair back. "We were just making an observation." Sandra turned to her, her expression unreadable. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she said, "So were we." The influencer's breath hitched. There was nothing left to say. From the back of the room, a well-known journalist, sharp, respected, always chasing the real story, stood up and made her way toward Sandra. "That was something," she said, holding out a recorder. "I'd love to talk to you about it." Sandra hesitated. Years of conditioning had told her to let things go, to avoid stirring controversy. But then she thought of all the times she had stayed silent. All the times women like her had been quietly erased, mocked, made to feel invisible. Not tonight. She met the journalist's gaze, then nodded. "I think it's an important conversation." The journalist smiled, already sensing the headline. "I think so too." Sandra stood, the energy around her different now. She wasn't just another guest at the show anymore, she was the moment. And as she walked toward the exit, she felt her phone vibrate. A message. She unlocked the screen and read it. "Good answer. See you at the premiere. K." Sandra smirked to herself, shaking her head, and without looking back, she walked forward, straight into a story that was no longer about staying relevant, but about redefining what that meant.